Welcome everybody to today's webinar from the Rec Code Manager. We are in the consultation period for R0101, the Safe Isolation Provider clarifications, and we're joined today by the lead analyst for the change for R101 and R21. That's Colette Baldwin from the Code Manager team, and Colette's going to be here to take you through some of the aspects of the changes, but more specifically to allow you to ask your questions, which should allow you to respond to the consultation, give you plenty of opportunity to engage with the code manager and the analysts involved in the change today, in support of your responses to that consultation. Just before we get going, a couple of bits of housekeeping and introductions to be made. You're not going to hear from me for long. I'm facilitating today in my role, Paul Rock, for those of you who don't know me, as the head of communications for the Rec Code Manager. I will shortly pass across to Colette Baldwin, as I mentioned, who's the lead change analyst for these changes, and she'll take you through the majority of the day and will support as best she can, answering the questions that are raised today, or triaging as appropriate to other members of the team, and providing the support she can. And you might also hear today from Georgina Scott-Picton or Ryan Dale, who also work within the Code Manager team and provide advice and support into these changes. The little bit of housekeeping that I wanted to go over. We do have a lot of people on the call today, so I will please encourage you to in this occasion keep your videos, your cameras turned off, just to help us with the stability of the call, and keep the focus. Colette will keep her camera switched on during today so that you can get the proper engagement from Colette as we move through. But also please keep your microphone switched off unless you're asked to sort of clarify a question, but we will be using Slido, please, to ask questions today. In a moment, I'll flick over to show you a QR code that you can use to navigate to the Slido page where you ask your questions, and a link to that site as well. It just helps us if we can record the questions in a written format. It helps us to be transparent after the event with the post-event write-up when we share those questions and answers with people, to make sure we don't miss anything, which can happen if there are verbal questions asked on the day. But we will also be, and we are, recording this event today, and we'll plan to share that with the industry following this session today, share it via the Rec Code Manager's YouTube channel, and share links via the Rec portal and in the Rec Weekly Bulletin. So just be aware the event is being recorded, but if you could use Slido to ask your questions, which we'll address throughout, that would be a great help. And as I say on the next slide here, you can either you can access Slido directly through Teams if you're using the web client. There should be an S logo in your Teams client, which will allow you to ask your questions, or you can navigate to slido.com, entering the code that appears on your screen now, or alternatively, you can use your smartphone or other smart device with a camera to take a picture of that QR code and be navigated to the appropriate Slido space where you'll have the opportunities to ask your questions. Hopefully I've left that on screen long enough. There should hopefully you should be able to see in the chat as well. The code is in the chat as well on the Teams call here. So if you lose that, you should be able to get it through there. I'm going to move over now to Colette, who I don't think we're necessarily going to use slides per se, are we, Colette? But we're going to sort of, we will share a slide deck after the event, which got some key information about it. But I think Colette is primarily going to take us through the changes and answer your questions as they come in through Slido today as well.
Excuse me. Okay, so Paul, are you going to keep? Oh, you're not going to put the slide back up. Okay.
I can keep the what I'll do. I'll keep the live questions up, so I'll navigate to that now.
Right.
You can talk while I'm getting.
Yes, I'll let you crack on then. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining. I know this has been something of a journey, this change, or should I say changes. We're in the midpoint of the consultation for the second change, and I thought it would be a final opportunity while you're working through the consultation itself, if there were any further points of clarity or questions about the solution that you had, rather than wait till you're putting in your consultation responses, that you would have the opportunity to ask any questions today, so that if there's something that we haven't covered at all, that it gives you that final opportunity to ask the question, get that clarified, and then help you complete the consultation response. So thank you for bearing with this. I don't really want to sort of go into thank you, we'll go with the flow, sort of go through the history and all the background and everything, other than to say there are a couple of things just to clarify what the safe isolated provider is. I mean, the REC MEM is somebody who is allowed to accede to DCUSA and become a safe isolated provider and carry out safe isolation works for premise owners. The idea being that it's a very simple, very narrow set of work. You'll be able to de-energize the entry or exit point. If you need to, you can adjust the terminals of the meter and then the associated equipment to remake the connection and to make it safe if necessary, if there was any disturbance of the connection, and terminate and replace the customer tails into the meter, and finally re-energize the metering point. We've always said we're keeping it very narrow. We never intended for the SIP to stray into the role of a MEM on site. That's the supplier, and the supplier's MEMs preserve. And there may be circumstances where the SIP will also be the MEM appointed to that supply point. But if they're there as a SIP, then they're carrying out SIP works, and they need to try and maintain those Chinese walls between the activities, and only step into the MEM space if they're ever need to, because of things that they find on site to do with safety. So I've got a couple of slides that just talk you through the process diagram. So if people have questions about the process, then I've got the process maps that we included in the change report, so that we can just flick to the relevant parts of the change process. And I've also got a slide just to clarify issues to do with the market messages and the differences that came up between R01 and R0101. So it might just be worth, while we're waiting for people to sort of think about their questions, is Paul, if we could just pop to slide 13 on my slide, which is the first of the market message slides.
Sorry. There we go.
I'm still seeing Slido.
Oh, hold on a second.
Sorry.
My mistake. I don't know why that's gone through. Let me just unshare and share again.
Hey, that's good. Lovely. So this is the whole sort of suite of the changes. So the changes to the existing market message, as well as the new, the existing market messages and the standards definition. And basically the colour coding is, if it was included in R21 and it isn't required for R0101, so as in the final solution, then it's red. If it is new, it's purple, and if it's yellow, it's an update. So you can see that for the D002, the scenario variant for SIP to supplier is new, but there's a new scenario variant reference number that will be included in the pre-release for that instance of that flow from the supplier to the SIP and the SIP to the supplier. The same for the 126, it's just the scenario variant reference number that is missing from the solution, but that's not part of the solution, it's part of the pre-release information. So when this change is finally resolved, and if hopefully it's approved, then that will be released in the pre-information. There was an intention to send a copy of the 139 included in R21 between the SIP and the MEM. It wasn't correct. It wasn't intended to be included. It is not being taken forward as part of R101, so that's why that one is in red. and we've added into the standards definition document an oversight, which was the inclusion of the SIP as a data service provider. So thank you to the person that pointed that one out. If it takes us on to the next slide, Paul. So the R21 flow that we proposed in R21 included these data items. So you can see within there was the MPAN core, the SIP ID, the supplier ID, the meter register ID, the date of action, so the date the work was completed, an inclusion of a site visit check code, the register reading, energization status, priority service category, and consent to share data, and then the catch-all additional information flow. It's fair to say we didn't get that flow right, and I think we caused more concern with it than we intended. It was one of those things that when we were intending to think about trying to notify the conditions that might cause some concern for vulnerable customers, we thought using the priority services categories, but on reflection, we feel that that caused more challenges than it solved. So that was what the original flow excuse me, included. And if we just bounce on to the next slide, the new flow actually is slightly different. So this is the new work complete flow, and it's got many of the same characteristics of the previous flow. Notable change is that instead of using the address as the address items, we've used the metering point address item. So the data items are slightly different from the original one. And instead of talking about priority services register categories, we've now changed that. And for just this flow only, we're introducing two elements. One is to note the medical dependency on electricity as a new J item, and a third party presence required as a new J item within the flows, because we don't want you to take this as an automatic update to the priority services register. And because when we were developing the solution, we were asked to share that information if it was collected with suppliers so that they could check their records to see what they held and take whatever action they could if it was necessary. We want to give that information to the suppliers, but we're concerned that this would end up being a refresh of PSR data, which had onward consequences of additional updates that would be needed. And we felt there was a risk that this may overwrite information that wasn't intended to be overwritten. So we've gone away from using the J item that referred to the PSR code, and we've introduced these two new SIP specific codes that are the only two vulnerabilities that the SIP will send through to the supplier, and they won't send them as PSR codes because we don't want them to be updated to the PSR register. We want the supplier to take note of them and then act on the information and verify the information before updating the PSR. And I think lastly, I've got a couple of slides that maybe just give you a side-by-side comparison. So it just shows you the same colour coding. The new items are in purple. Things that we've deleted from the flow are in red. So you can see there that we've taken out the priority services category. We've also taken out the site visit check code and register reading. And we have changed the address from the J items for address to the J items for metering point address. So in reality, what you can see is although the flow looks bigger in terms of the number of data items, that's only because in terms of the address lines that were included in the first flow, we only provided lines 1 and 2 and inferred lines 3 to 9. In the new version of the flow, we've actually included all of the lines, so it looks slightly bigger, but actually slightly smaller in reality. And is there another slide on that one, Paul, or is that? No, right. So at this point, Paul, where are we at with the Slido?
Yeah, we've got a good number of questions that have been asked. We had some, didn't we, Colette, in terms of questions that have been asked pre-event, and they're kind of all related to the same point. So I wonder if it's just worth noting them. We've got the two you can see on the screen from the pre-event question, which I'm just going to bring to the at the top there that are related, and then we can move on to the other questions that are being asked.
R21, is it just the code changes being introduced rather than the actual data flows? So because we needed to correct the mistakes that were made with the data flows for R21, you're right, R21 does deliver the role of the SIP and the processors, but R21 corrects and introduces the correct data flows. So you could almost treat them as two separate activities, yes.
Great. And then we had another pre-event question here around when will the new market message ID or data flow number be released for R21?
So new market messages and any of the information to do with the J items, the other elements of the flow that are new, those information are made available in the pre-release information. So that will be released shortly after a decision is made on the change. So if the change is approved, then the release information will be shared shortly afterwards. I'm not quite sure, Ryan, do we have a date for that?
Not as yet, no, but obviously working to as soon as possible.
And I think before I move on to the final pre-event question, it's therefore worth flagging up a question that relates to the pre-release, which I think is on some people's lips. But why has it taken so long for the pre-release to come out if delivery for the change is planned for June and finite delivery by November the 3rd?
So originally, when we were made aware of the problems with the data flows in R21, we were aiming for so we had originally planned for a June release with the data flows, identified that there was an impact and thought that we would have to delay the implementation of R21. And so we sort of started off with the approach that we were going to defer R21 until implementation in November. And therefore there was no release of information for R21 with the June release, because the effect of R0101 would have overwritten the implementation date of R21 to the 3rd of November. When we realised that, excuse me, that that the original plan to defer the implementation was not likely to effectively go ahead now. We'd have conversations with Dacusa, we'd have conversations with Ofgem, and there was quite a sort of strong feeling that this change had considerable benefits identified. The solution was introducing competition in an area where parties, well, consumers and people who provide premises for people who use energy, who needed access to these services and couldn't get it at the moment. This created a solution for those parties to get access to these services, and delaying it was as a detriment, and that was felt to be the delay was felt to be a lesser detriment. A greater detriment than the impact of the amendments that were needed to the market messages. And Ofgem said it would have to have a really strong case to justify deferral of the change to November, and we didn't feel that that case was there. So therefore we took the view not to ask for the deferral, but to take the approach of introducing a phased implementation approach, which would be such that those that could implement the changes and who were ready for them, capable of implementing the technical solution from 30th of June, could go ahead, and that those SIPs that want to implement and work as a SIP will obviously be motivated to make those changes so that they can enter the market. But for those other parties who aren't quite as advanced in their preparations for this, who might need the extra time to November, a phased implementation date will allow them to take a little bit longer to implement the changes, and therefore so the release information has been held back for the June one. You would normally have had it by now, while we're waiting for the outcome of the decision on R101. And unfortunately, that was delayed because of the sort of toing and froing on the approach. So apologies from the code manager for the lack of clarity on that and the short timescale in terms of the really pre-release information, but hopefully we won't have to wait for it much longer.
And while we're on the topic, then a couple of newer questions that have come through, which are related. When is a decision expected for R0101, and when will we know a date for the pre-release?
So the change plan for the change, the consultation closes on the 16th of May. So as soon as we get your responses back, we'll then be updating the preliminary change report with the consultation responses and drafting the final change report. And that will be published on the 19th of May with the code manager's recommendation included in it. And that will go to MEP for a decision, and we expect to have a decision on the change by the 26th of May.
Right, and will that directly impact the date of the pre-release?
I've just been sent a message to say that RTS are planning to provide the pre-release information on the 30th of May on the basis of a decision being made by the MEP on the 26th.
Thank you very much.
Takes into account of the bank holiday. Another one.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of bank holidays coming. I guess while we're looking at similar questions, just I think a comment more than a question, this one, but a view that it didn't feel right that the changes weren't being introduced at the same time, and that the phase implementation seems messy. Is there a view from the code manager on that one?
Trying to be pragmatic. In an ideal world, we would have delayed and brought the whole thing together at the same time. And, you know, personally, I apologise that we haven't done this as well as we could have done. You know, having if we got the technical elements of the change right when we shared it with you in the original change, we would have. Everything would have gone in at the end of June as originally intended. So, as I say, personally, I apologise for that. We've been getting a lot of inquiries from parties who want to become SIPs. We've also had contact directly from organisations who want to employ SIPs. And that it's fair to say that we've had social housing companies, local authorities contacting us directly, who are desperate for an authorised solution, because at the moment
Is that frozen for anybody else, or is it just me?
Yeah. No,
yes, I think it's a.
She's been caught short in let down by technology. Let's give her a second to see if she's managed to restore a connection. Apologies. Please do continue to raise your questions on Slido. I appreciate that there's plenty of questions being asked, which shows a great level of engagement. So thank you very much for continuing to ask your questions. Hopefully, those of you who have had their questions answered feel the answers have been comprehensive. If you do have follow-up questions to your questions, do let us know, and we'll be as comprehensive as we can. And any questions that we're not able to answer today as well, we will provide an answer in a consolidated FAQs document following the session that we'll share with any post-event materials as well. So if we don't get around to answering all the questions today, know that your question will be answered post-event, but we will try to get through all of them. Hello, Colette, you've returned to us.
I've joined on a different internet connection, so hopefully it might survive.
You're a bit grainy, but I think the most important thing is that we can hear you, isn't it? So I'll let you resume.
I'm connecting over my phone, so I'm actually going to go off camera if you don't mind.
Yeah,
because yeah, the mobile connection's not great. So sorry, where was I? I was explaining about so we've had a lot of contact from people who are desperate for a solution. We're also mindful of the fact that this work is being done illegally at the moment, without the consent of anybody, without the visibility of anyone, and that customers are not being protected when this work is being done. Transparency, no account.
We're having trouble with You again, I'm afraid you're
getting
seem to have lost your audio, which is being very sporadic and breaking up quite a lot, I'm afraid. I don't know if you're able to.
I'm going to rejoin, Paul. Sorry
Okay.
about this.
No worries at all. Apologies, guys. Don't want you to get half the story. Rather we get this right. Let's take 1 minute to see what we can do. For the person in the comments who had asked for a sort of a potted history for the change, it's definitely something. If it's okay, I'll get Colette just to focus on the immediate questions around the implementation impacts and the timescales, and then just return with a brief potted history, if that's all right. Once we've done that. But Colette, you're back with us now. You look clearer again, so hopefully the connection is
Hopefully I'm back online. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Thank you. Okay, so as I said, we were getting, apologies for the internet connection, we're getting quite a lot of inquiries. The work is being done illegally at the moment with no transparency or accountability, and to wait longer feels that we're missing the opportunity to get proper governance around this process, to get a service available to consumers who are looking for it, also premise owners who are looking for this service. So we think it's the right thing to do rather than delay for a further sort of period, where those parties who are able to implement it go live as soon as they can, and allow others to be able to join them at their own pace when they're ready, but ultimately by the 3rd of November. So we think pragmatically it's the right thing to do as well, but appreciate it's not been the best journey. So hopefully with this couple of interruptions, I hope that's come across clearly enough.
Correct. And as I just said, as you were joining there, I think we'll just focus on clearing off the last of the few sort of implementation related questions here, if that's all right.
Yep.
A question here: that implementation is tied to the DACUSA change, and MEMS have invested time and money into their applications to DACUSA to become SIPs. This also relates to another question. That was a comment, but relates to a question just below here. Does this mean that if accession to DACUSA is in place before June, SIPs can continue as normal?
SIPs can't start work until the end of June. 29th of June is the earliest date at which a SIP is, even though they start their accession process earlier than that the permissions in DACUSA don't come into being until 29th of June. And under the REC, they don't, because there's a day difference in implementation. The REC implementation is the 30th of June. So the process takes a little time because there's an application process for DACUSA to be gone through, and once that's completed, there's a handoff to the REC. There's also, once that's party registers updated and we've got all the necessary things all lined up, there's also the BSC roll code that's needed to be applied, and there's a time frame around that as well. So you can't just sort of accede today and start working tomorrow, because other things need to stack up behind it. So that's why there's a lag between the opening of the applications and the go live date of the solution.
Thank you very much. Just finally on implementation, I think, and it's, I guess, related to the phased approach question, but what is the interim process for parties who are not ready for June? Where can we find what's expected of us, and how will SIPs communicate to parties? Kind of an amalgamation of a couple of questions there, but I think I was focused on the first one. What about,
okay,
what are the process for parties who aren't ready in June?
We published, alongside the publication of the PCR, a document that sets out what we intended to be the process between 30th of June and the 3rd of November for those parties who want to take advantage of the phased implementation approach. So we're saying that for those parties, if the SIP is ready and the SIP goes live, they should be able to send the flows. If the supplier who is going to be the recipient of the flow hasn't implemented those flows yet, REC is going to hold on the register those parties and their accession state to this process. So as part of our implementation approach, your OAMs will be in touch with suppliers and with MEMS who are going to be SIPs to confirm at what point they're going to be ready to go, whether it's June or some date between June and November. And we will hold a record of all of that, and we'll share that information with the SIPs so that when they need to send their flows, they know whether they can send a data flow, or for the category A, B and C notifications that go through on the various flows, or for theft reporting, they will telephone the SIP. With the supplier. The SIP will telephone the supplier to make contact with them to let them know what they've found and that action needs to be taken. And the same with de-energisation and re-energisation. We think that a telephone call is probably reasonable because faults obviously need to be attended to quickly. Category A equivalent for suppliers, immediate danger, need to be handled very quickly. So telephone calls are the right thing in those scenarios anyway. For category B, faults equivalents to the suppliers, where it's hazard but not danger, then the supplier will then have put in place an arrangement then to go and book the job with their MEM, and then they'll need to let the SIP know if the SIP hasn't undertaken the de-energisation already. They'll need to let them know that they can return to site when that fault is rectified. So we expect there to be a telephone call between them, but given that we expect the majority of the jobs to go through with not too much difficulty, we think that these telephone calls shouldn't create an onerous burden on suppliers or the SIPs where they need to be made. So it's the hazards for the suppliers, and the B's and C notifications will need to be made by telephone to the DNOs, and obviously the equivalent of category A, the supplier and DNO need to be made by telephone anyway. The last question is the pre-notifications. The DNOs decided that if there wasn't a flow to pre-notification of the work to the DNO, or the DNOs didn't develop an app, that they were happy to not receive the pre-notifications. And so if at this stage there is no requirement to pre-notify the DNO until they either develop an app or until DCP 419 is progressed. And that just leaves the work complete flow from the new flow being introduced by the supplier, for the supplier, sorry. In this workaround, we propose that the supplier doesn't receive the work complete flow for the period between the end of June and the beginning of November unless they've implemented the data flows. So it's for those suppliers who've not implemented the flows at the earliest opportunity, they will not receive the information at all. There's a question about whether, and I'd be interested in people's views, as to whether they would like the information to be prepared and sent and they'll queue it at their gateways for when they've implemented the flows, or whether they would just like the information to be held somewhere as a backup to be interrogated if a problem is identified. Bear in mind that the information in this new flow is to confirm an outcome, that the work was carried out, the date it was carried out, and who did it. And the usefulness of the flow is only really as a backup in case something has gone amiss. Either there's a liabilities issue that the supplier needs to address, or the DNO needs to address, and it's giving that supplier the transparency of who it was that attended. That's over and above the fact that they use their sealing pliers, which should be visible on site as well. So it's a bit of a sort of belt and braces approach, really. So I think for the short term, for using a solution that would, in the same way we've suggested using telephone calls, that it would be too onerous to expect the SIP to phone through every single job to the suppliers, and for the suppliers to act on the information and update their systems with it. We think it's probably unlikely that they would take that step, and therefore we're proposing to make it as an optional process during the phased implementation. But from the 3rd of November, all parties will be required to be able to send and receive the flow.
We have a lot of questions coming through, so what I'm going to start to do in a second, I'm going to sort by the most upvoted questions being asked. So if you're on Slido, guys, and you see a question that you think is relevant to you, you can give it a thumbs up and it will rise to the top, and we can address the most pertinent questions that way. But before we do, I did have a question from someone, Colette, just for those who might not be so aware, whether there is sort of a very brief potted history that we can give of this change. Is there a way we can describe this in sort of an elevator pitch for the change, as it were?
Well, obviously the preliminary change report sets out a summary and a background. So, I mean, this was creating a new role for existing MEMS who want to be able to act as a SIP and provide safe isolation services to premise owners. Obviously, there's a route for the consumers and their suppliers to provide this service, but local authorities, social housing, other private landlords, whether that could be commercial landlords or domestic landlords, if they're not the supplier's customer, we're finding it difficult to get a service. So this solution was put forward as a means whereby those who own the premises but don't necessarily have the contract with the energy company could procure the services of a SIP who could arrange for the supply to be de-energised and then re-energised to allow the landlord to install things like electric vehicle charging points or even just isolators. It was supporting the rollout of low and zero carbon technology equipment, as well as improving the safety for the occupiers of rented properties. So we wanted to create a very narrow scope. We're very keen to not make sure that the role was not straying between the SIP and the MEM, that there was very clear boundary. That's why we've been very specific about what the SIP can do. It doesn't go beyond de-energise and then re-energise and do the slight adjustments that might be necessary. But the SIP is under no illusion that they cannot undertake any other work, such as installing or replacing meters, unless, and it's a heavily caveated unless, that the supplier asks their MEM, who is the same party as the SIP, because they've reported a fault. If the SIP is asked to act as a MEM on that occasion by that supplier while they're on site to do that work, that is the only time that the SIP is allowed to stray outside of its boundary and act as a MEM therefore, and then at completion of whatever fault rectification or damage rectification they need to take, they step back into the SIP role and then re-energise the site and complete the work. So I think that's a fairly simple overview. We've tried to keep the communications light so that we don't put lots of burdens on people with regard to comms. So fault reporting, we set out, we tried to use the existing flows so as not to cause too much disruption. We've said that the SIP should de-energise and re-energise the site within the same day. What we don't want is SIPs going into properties and leaving occupiers without access to electricity, and therefore the expectation is re-energisation should take place on the same day. There may be some circumstances where that doesn't happen because of fault rectification or other problems. They should again be very few and far between, but we want the SIP to tell the supplier if that is the case, and then it will be up to the supplier to decide then what next steps to take. The supplier may send out a MEM, or the DNO may attend and resolve whatever the damage or fault is, and then it'd be a case of the SIP communicating that they'd go back to site because the DNO or the supplier have told them the fault's fixed, and then the supplier will send the re-energisation and the completion notice on the day they go back and re-energise. So it's a very, very light touch.
Thank you, Colette. You mentioned a while ago around a BSC SIP role code, just some very helpful people in the comments and Slido clarifying that the role code is in place, went live in April, and that the role code for the SIP is the role code Y. So thank you for those who provided that feedback in the Slido comments.
Also, Paul, just to add that it takes a month or thereabouts. There's a cycle to getting your roll code applied and approved. So you submit your application to the BSc and it goes through their change process to add you to add your ID to that roll code, the other way around, add your roll code to your account effectively. So I think you just need to be mindful of that. That can take up to about a month.
Great. Thank you. We have 24 questions that are still unanswered in the chat. I've sorted them by, as I said, the most upvoted at the moment. So going to take them generally in order now. So the first one there, as you can see, Colette, under Rec Schedule 14, the 139s are sent from the DNO to both the supplier and the MEM. So it seems sensible for the R01 solution to mirror this. I guess less a question, more of a feedback on the solution there.
Yeah, we've gone around the loop on this one a number of times. So initially, when we were asked to include an instance of the 139 to the supplier from the SIP, it was so that the supplier, if they needed to take any action, that they could choose to do so, and that we considered, I think it was put forward in the technical solution that there would be an instance of that flow from the SIP to the MEM as well. That wasn't in the, I suppose, in the text intentionally. It wasn't intended to be included, but it was accidentally included in the schematics for the market messages, which has led to a number of parties sort of being confused about whether it was in or whether it was out. We have gone around the houses on this one quite a lot. The thing is that if we send a 139 to the MEM, then the MEM expects something to happen and or to take some action. And we felt that the likelihood was that the SIP isn't, it's an unusual situation for the SIP to go in and do some work and send this information to the MEM and then for the MEM to take action on the back of it, because normally the requests for the sort of fault remedies or anything that would lead to the de-energisation and re-energisation would normally be driven either by the supplier or the DNO fault reporting, either directly from the consumer or from somebody else who's visited the site. And the risk here we felt was that it was an extra step in the process for the SIP, that we hadn't normally expected the SIP to do communications to the suppliers' MEMs. We've tried to stay away from any MEM inclusion in the SIP roles, and so that there's complete sort of dividing line between the two. But the other thing is in terms of fault rectification or meter replacement or danger resolution or whatever, it's likely that if the SIP were to send the de-energisation flow to the MEM wouldn't be acting on the instruction of the SIP. They would then be looking at information coming in from the supplier or the DNO. And they potentially, by the time they receive the SIP notification, which would be sent by the end of the next working day, they could already have been out to site and rectified the problem. And therefore, they would have to build a process to trap these 139s and not act on them, rather than just process them as normal. So we felt that, you know, there was as many problems with including the DNO, sorry, the SIP to supply, SIP to MEM instance of the flow as not including it. So given that we have also set out that the de-energisation and re-energisation requirements are to happen within the same day, there should be rare events when the SIP needs to send a 139, and therefore, and if it is in the space of dealing with danger or damage, that the likelihood of them needing to take action on the back of it was quite limited, and therefore we felt that in pragmatically the 139 instance from the MEM to the SIP, sorry, from the SIP to the MEM wasn't necessary. We went to the MEP metering expert panel and we asked for opinions on this, and they agreed not to include the instance of the flow. So that's why it's not there.
Thanks, Colette. The next question on the list, what's the process if the SIP goes to connect the smart meter up again and the meter doesn't work or connect?
In this solution overview document, there's one of the sections that talks about the smart comms, and we have given some guidance in the document as to what the SIP should expect to see on site and what they should be looking for to see that comms have been re-established. And so, you know, we've advised the SIP to either photograph or video the comms hub information so that they can see which lights are on, which lights are off, so that they reinstate the meter with the same outcome at the end of it. So we've suggested that that's a sensible check for the SIP to take. If there are scenarios where after all the necessary things have been checked that the SIP is unable to reconnect the smart comms, the SIP needs to alert the supplier. Now, I've asked this in the consultation of people because there were two schools of thought on this one. One is that we could just telephone the information through to the supplier and let the supplier know that the comms aren't working and that they need to deal with it. And the other option is, should the supplier send the equivalent of the D2, which is effectively to report a fault, to the supplier, would the suppliers prefer to receive that information that way rather than a telephone call? So I think we're going to go with whichever comes out to be the preferred solution in the consultation responses. So if you have strong opinions about which way to go, it's I think it's question 5 in the consultation response. So but ultimately, you know, the SIP can only do so much on site. Some of it might be might need to be attempted to be reconnected by the supplier, or it may be that it might need a mem effectively to come out and do it. I know it happened a couple of times on my own when my power went off at home. The supplier I was with was able to re-establish the comms remotely. I don't know how, because I'm not in the detail of that, but another time they had to come out. It's a bit random really as to what it was that why it triggered sometimes and not others. So, but ultimately we do need the supplier and the consumer to know that the comms aren't working, and it'll either be whichever you decide, telephone call or D2. But we'll leave it up to consultation responses to make that choice.
Thanks, Colette. Speaking of telephone calls, what do we do as a supplier if we don't have a dedicated phone line and instead need the information provided in a different way?
Because without knowing what the different way is, it's hard for us to comment. Normally we would send information between parties via market messages, and where that's not the case, I mean, certainly I'm sorry, I'm hearing thunder and lightning here, so I apologise if my connection goes off again. If we're asking for contact telephone numbers because we think that some of these things are important enough to report urgently and have confidence that that message has been received and acted on, and therefore we are asking as a telephone number for those callers. I think if somebody is not able to provide a telephone number for us, I think they'll have to contact us to discuss what an option might be. But I think it would be unusual for a business not to have a number that we can make these calls to.
Amy at EDF, you have your hand raised. Was it in relation to this question?
Yeah, so it was just off the back of it, because I know that you mentioned that if we didn't know other ways to contact. So would it be that you're looking to contact us through an emergency line that we already have, or would it just be that you would look for contact to be made through our regular call centres? My main concerns being that our regular call centre staff wouldn't know what to do with this information and wouldn't potentially know what to do off the back of it. And it's I'm just kind of trying to look at all of the options that we potentially have as a supplier. Is if we're not able to provide a dedicated phone line number, what else can we look to do to be ensure we're getting the right information to and from the SIP and ourselves?
That your call centres are probably not the right place for this, because, as you say, training this out to all your call centre staff for larger companies would be an onerous obligation, and I think you know, it would be we're talking about for a short-term period. Obviously, the emergency fault for dangerous situations with the meter, that does need a telephone line because we expect urgent action to be taken. Because don't forget, normally this would be identified by your MEM, and if they go to site and find a dangerous situation and it either needs the DNO or maybe the meter reader's gone out and found it, I don't know, trying to think of circumstances, but it needs somebody to address the matter urgently. Now, when it's your MEM that's gone out on site and found there's danger there, and they can deal with that immediately, but where it's somebody else that finds that situation, there must be other ways that your companies need to be able to receive that type of call to get that action in a relatively short space of time. So I think it's
I'll need
just trying to.
Yeah, I'll take that action away to just check how it would be raised as an emergency from our MEMS or separate MEMS at the moment. But I know that obviously a lot of those calls do go through to our DNOs. So what would happen in that instance? So if it isn't an issue that a MEM could complete or deal with, how would the SIP then make the DNO aware? Would that be through the flows or would it be through a phone call?
We'll make it's equivalent of a category A. The SIP will contact the DNO by phone, and we're asking the supplier for an equivalent.
Okay, cool. Thank
that
you.
You can get your MEM out site quickly. And obviously, the SIP can only make it safe. He can't do anything else, or she can't do anything else.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your elaboration, Amy. Next question then. How much is SIP activity expected to impact the non-domestic market, Colette?
I don't know if impacting it is the right way I would put it. I think there's an opportunity for any landlord or any types of premises to take advantage of the service. So if you're, I'm trying to think of the scenarios. I mean, if you're in a sort of like a business park and you want to install electric vehicle charging points around the business park for your tenants, there's no reason why SIP couldn't do that for you. Equally, small retail outlets inside a what you call it, housing estates where they have these sort of banks of small premises. There's no reason why sort of non-domestic customers should be treated any differently, really. So it's a case of whether the landlords spot the opportunity and decide to take it. It's really open to whoever wants to use the service. It's not restricted, and I think that's the issue. It's not a domestic only issue. This is something that affects lots of businesses as well as domestic customers.
Thanks, Colette. The next question then on the list: will the new R0101 flow always be accompanied by one of the new variants of the D2 and D139 when being issued to suppliers from the SIP?
Well, no one could be accompanied by. No. So if the SIP goes to site and they do the work in the day and there are no problems, the new flow will get issued to the supplier to say, we were here today, we've completed de-energisation, re-energisation within the same day. Oh, by the way, we identified there needs to be a third party or there was a medical dependency on electricity. If there was no fault or dangerous situation, or the 139, if they were not able, if they re-energised within the same day, there'd be no reason to send the 139. If there were no faults or any instances of theft or anything like that, no reason to send any other flow. So the only time the new market message would be accompanied by another flow is if after there's been a period of de-energisation that's lasted beyond the day, and if there's the equivalent of a category B or the supplier's equivalent of a hazardous category B equivalent type, if those faults are made safe, and the de-energisation and re-energisation was able to go ahead because it wasn't impacted, they could still do the appropriate tests and carry out the work without any concerns or issues, then there might be other flows, but it wouldn't always be a given that there'd be other flows that came with it.
Perhaps this might that may have answered the next question as well, but is there any more full answer you can give to the question? Is there any way it can be confirmed exactly which flows need to be sent as a SIP and which ones need to be received if not a SIP?
The solution overview document that's on the change page, there are a set of process diagrams, and the process diagrams in the preliminary change report have got the flow numbers included, with the exception of the new flow number, because that's obviously not yet published. So if you want to interrogate the process and see which flows are sent in what circumstances, those documents should give you that clarity.
Is that on the change proposal page for R0101 or R21? R101. Okay,
It was a slightly higher level flow diagram included in R21, so we decided to publish R101, the same flow diagrams but to a lower level of detail.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
So maintain that solution overview document once the decision on the change is made, so that we'll retain that as guidance, as a rec wiki article, so people can go and double check it further down the line if they want to.
Thank you very much. Hopefully those on the call are aware of how to navigate to those pages on the portal. If you're not, obviously you can get in touch with us or Colette, or through our live chat on the portal after the session, and we'll be more than happy to point you in the right direction to that page as well. What I am going to very quickly do in the chat is just send you a direct link to the change proposal page, which you do need a portal account to be able to access it, but it's nice and easy if you don't have a portal account to be able to access that as well. So as Colette says, the information in the solution overview document, which is hosted on that page, I believe the latest version of that is version 4.0 on that page there. Yeah. Fantastic. Let's move to the next question then, which is, what are the obligations on SIPs to pre-notify suppliers of work? Who's liable for the actions of the SIP if they damage meters or fail to re-energize?
Two questions. So the first part of that question, there is no obligation on the SIP to pre-notify the supplier of the work. The point of the change was to allow the SIP to accede to DCUSA, and under DCUSA for the SIP to get the right from the DNO and the supplier to work on those metering points directly without pre-notice. The DNOs have asked for pre-notice only in the future to deal with smart meter alerts of outages, so that if they get pinged, say the power's gone off where the SIP's taken the meter, de-energized it, but they don't send out a person in a van to go and check whether the customer has got an outage or whether it's planned work. So it's worth following DCP 419 for DCUSA, which is a new change that's being introduced to manage that pre-notification of work to DNOs. Who is liable for the actions of the SIP if they damage meters or it fails to re-energize, etc.? So the SIP is a MEM first and foremost. Please don't forget that. I mean, ultimately, the MEM is qualified to work on a metering point. They've got all the requisite skills and training to be accredited as a REC MEM, and therefore it's unlikely the SIP will damage the meter. In the unlikely event that that does happen, and I do think it should be an unlikely event, the liabilities regime that exists under DCUSA, because the SIP has directly acceded to DCUSA, then the supplier and the DNO have a liabilities framework, which means that they can look to the SIP to address any liability payments through that route, but it's not done under the REC, that's under DCUSA.
Thank you. The next question on priority services register. Will SIP parties be able to update suppliers on PSR information if they find on site something that isn't already on the PSR?
SIP isn't there to do any assessment of PSR. They're not under any obligation to collect PSR information or to transfer it on. We've asked two questions of the landlord and the SIP, is that they need to make sure as part of their risk assessment that it's safe to de-energise the metering point, that there's no dependency on the electricity that would leave a customer facing harm. So that's why we said medical dependency on electricity. So we don't want somebody on a respirator finding somebody's been de-energised without somebody being aware of it. And the other one is the requirement for a third party to be present. Social housing, we want to make sure that the needs of people potentially in social housing might be considered if there were health needs or cultural needs for any premises where a third party was required to be on site when the SIP was there. So we've said we'll collect both of those sets of information. We're calling them ANI, SIP ANI, additional needs information, so that we don't confuse this with PSR. The PSR remains the obligation of the supplier and the DNO to collect and validate. We've said we'll share the information about third party and medical dependency on electricity with the supplier, so that if they aren't aware, they get that information. But the SIP couldn't be expected to do a full PSR assessment, and therefore any suggestion of collecting PSR data, it's got a whole sort of raft of issues around data protection and transmission of the information, consent to share. It's also, there would be risks around, has the SIP, are they adequately trained to collect this information and share it with the supplier or the DNO? A MEM isn't generally required to collect PSR information, and therefore we didn't feel it appropriate to ask the SIP to do the same.
Thank you. A related question, it's not at the top of the list, but I think it overlaps somewhat. Is the SIP obligated to report theft activities if found to suppliers?
It's covered in the solution. I believe it's the D135 flow. If they don't know which supplier, if for whatever reason they're not clear on which supplier is the relevant supplier for the property, then they report it to the UK RPA. But absolutely always they should report any suggestion of theft to the supplier.
Thank you, Colette. Okay, the next question. When are the meetings from the operational account managers expected to start? There may be dependencies which may prevent us knowing a ready date for the next few weeks.
Equally, until the change is approved, we didn't think it prudent to start contacting you all for your information. So the OAMs, I've got a briefing with them tomorrow, so they start to get ready to do this. So when they'll kick it off, I'm not 110% sure which days it will start, but I think it's not likely to start until the change is approved. So I would say shortly after that.
Thank you, Colette. The next question, what protections are there against SIPs re-energizing meters in commercial contexts where they have been de-energized by the supplier in debt recovery cases?
You're not allowed. If the SIP attends a site and finds the site has an existing de-energisation in place, the SIP is to abort the job and walk away. Categorical.
Fantastic. Thank you. This might be a how long is a piece of string question, I don't know. How long does it take to become a registered SIP from start to finish?
Right, that is a how long as a piece of string. So we're not in control of the process start to finish. It's a 3-part scenario. So if you, it depends how you kick the journey off. If you talk to the rec, to your OAM first, they'll point you at DACUSA. DACUSA will then go the process of getting you acceded. So you'll go through their accession process. They'll tell us when that's complete, and I don't know quite what's involved in their accession process. Once they've completed their processes, the information will come back to the rep to say whether a SIP's been accepted or not. The OAM will contact the SIP and let them know the outcome, and then the SIP will be advised to apply for the roll code in the BSC. That process takes a month, depending on where you fall in the cycle. So it is a bit inexact. So I suppose it's a question of, to some degree, the SIP's in the driving seat in terms of responding to information that the DACUSA might need, and then completing and sending paperwork back, and then when they fall in the cycle with BSC. So I think yeah, I mean, the reason we've opened up the process early is to give people time to be ready, so that they can be ready and to go as quickly as the solution goes live.
Thank you, Colette. The next few questions were actually asked some time ago, so apologies if you may have answered these in part, but I think for completeness, best to run through them just in case I misinterpret. Can I ask what the SIP to supplier and MEM comms methods for between June to November, assuming R0101 gets approved?
Phone. So because we think the instances of these scenarios where the SIP needs to alert the supplier, there are no SIP to MEM comms. Where the SIP needs to alert the supplier or the DNO, that there'll be where there's instances of danger, damage, or interference, or the extended de-energization, re-energization. They shouldn't be the bulk of the work. We think there'll be, if it's happening every day, that suggests more problems out there than we know about. So we think it's likely to be infrequent, and therefore telephone is an appropriate method. And that's what we've opted for.
Thank you, Colette. The next question, consideration, that it seems that the changes have been rushed so that SIPs can enter the market rather than a carefully planned change with fully aligned change. I'm sure that's not the case, but
Which isn't. I think it's. I do get the concern about the having to use a phased implementation approach, and it isn't a case of rushing to create a market. The changes were debated over a long period of time in DACUSA before the change was raised, and then taken through that process with the REC process alongside it, and so. We were sort of working through to make sure we got it right. So it hasn't been one of those changes that have just sort of been dropped in, picked up very quickly and rushed through. As I say earlier, we apologise for the mistakes over the market messages and the confusion that caused, which resulted in the second change. And that's why we've sort of got this two-stage approach with phased implementation. We do recognise that it's not a rush to create a market. It's more a case of also we recognise that this is happening illegally today, and we're trying to ensure that we've got the solution ready so that we can stop that activity happening at the earliest opportunity and make sure that those people that want to do the jobs legitimately, and that includes the landlords, that they don't want to be instructing people to pull fuses without the appropriate permissions, that there is a mechanism for them to do this. So I think there's an element of pragmatism in terms of it would be easy to defer 21 and say we'll do it all in November, but that would allow this illegal activity to keep going. And also you have to say it's in some ways it's our fault that this has been held up, and therefore is it right to hold back when we can put some alternatives in place to make this work, so that from consumers' perspective and from landlords' perspective, for the benefit of consumers, these solutions can be available sooner rather than later. We think that's the right thing to do, but I don't think it's been rushed through. I think it's been held up because of the mistake we made.
Thank you, Colette. What are the considerations and impacts of parties that receive new flow or variants who have not gone live at that time due to early SIP trailblazers?
Wow. So SIP trailblazers. We think it's right that those SIPs that want to enter the market should be capable of doing the flows. There may be suppliers out there who have prepared and are ready or are able to react more quickly than others to get this solution live. We do recognise that different organisations have got different change arrangements in place, and therefore the ability to implement things might be different across the supply community. So we think the SIPs should be ready to go with the full solution, and then adjust for whether it's a data flow solution or whether it's a workaround solution. So we have considered that. We do want we want to make sure that the SIPs are doing as much as possible to make this work, but also we don't want to put unreasonable burdens on suppliers, and therefore there's a balancing act between how much they can put into going live between June and November at the earliest opportunity versus how they can support the workarounds in the same period. So I think we're giving suppliers the discretion to choose how to deploy the resources. I think is the approach we feel we've taken.
Thanks, Colette. The next question then, what's the governance around a SIP who might complete more work than a SIP is expected or allowed to do? How is the REC going to manage this?
Confused by the question.
I think what they're saying is how is REC going to manage a SIP who acts outside of their authority with the work that they're permitted to do?
Hey, well, first of all, the SIP is subject as a MEM to the audit arrangements under the REC, and therefore any SIP work is subject to audit, and that will be one of the considerations about what's been done on site. Been very clear about what the SIP can do, and we've tried to keep it particularly narrow. The SIP isn't likely to go beyond the scope of their remit because the risk to them is great. If they find that they've breached the DCUSA, they will effectively lose their accession under DCUSA, and the DCUSA will obviously advise the REC of this, and then there will be a question asked about whether that REC party has behaved appropriately and whether that puts their REC party accreditation in jeopardy, not just as a SIP but as a MEM, because the point of this is that these are MEMs first, and so going beyond the remit and putting their MEM accreditation at risk, I would have said, is probably a bigger risk for them. So I think it's a compliance management issue for the REC performance assurance, but also the question around DCUSA having any reported breaches to the DCUSA arrangements being appropriately reported, and I think there's enough parties sufficiently interested in how this works, which will address that if there's a problem.
I know we've got Georgina on the call today. I don't want to put you on the spot, Georgina, but is there anything from a performance assurance side that you wanted to add on to that response?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking this is something that I could respond to. Even under current MEMS, we handle non-compliances for ComCop itself. So whether or not it gets flagged as part of the audit process, we get a list of non-compliances, or if it gets flagged to us by individuals who say we are aware of someone who's performing outside of their obligations, we do investigations and we take actions as appropriate. And as Colette was saying, in the extremity of it, it could require them to lose their MEM accreditation.
Thanks, G. The next question actually is quite relevant to this, and while you're on the call, it makes sense to ask it. Does this mean REC will do on-site audits on SIPs in the future? It seems the only way to be sure that the SIP is working under its remit.
Yes, in fact, we already do on-site audits for MEMS. So audits are made up of both desktop and site audit elements. Site audits can be comprised of work in progress and or post-complete, depending on what's applicable at the time, and that's determined by the auditor. So the way it will work is that SIP work will be considered within the scope of what could be audited each year, and they will be required to showcase that they are compliant in terms of the energization and de-energization work that they carry out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your answer there. All right, next question then. Meter readings will be essential for suppliers when the meter is de-energized for settlements, especially if this takes more than one day and is for a large business. Less of a question, again, more of a consideration.
Yeah, and that's why we have said that if the SIP is going to have the site off supply for more than a day, obviously they have to send the de-energisation and re-energisation flows, and that will include the meter readings. There within the day, lots of businesses not just businesses, lots of properties at some point in the day can lose their energy supply for short periods of time, and that doesn't normally generate a set of flows to the supplier or the supply agents. So we don't think this is massively different from that. I think if it's going to be a larger job, then I don't imagine that it would. I'm struggling to think of a scenario where this would have a significant impact if they were only de-energising and re-energising to allow the installation of an isolator or a ECV or an equivalent. As I say, the intention is that they're done within the day, and therefore the D139s are only sent if that takes place if it takes place outside that single day, and they will include meter readings.
Thanks, Colette. Just trying to understand this question. Just flows in place for SIP to be live. Is there a COP to be complied with, audited on, etc.? Will a SIP need DSRs, or does being a MEM cover all this? Not sure if you can interpret that a little clearer
not
than I
overly,
can.
no. So the SIP does need to have the flows in place to be ready to go. So we want to make sure that the SIP can either work with those suppliers who are ready for the 30th of June or those who need the extra time. So it's only right that the SIP is, as the new entrant into this market, is fully functioning and able to operate, and therefore until they can send the flows, they shouldn't start work. Is there a COP to be complied with, audited on, etc.? Is there a code of practice to be complied with and audited on? It's not a code of practice. There's some absolute requirements. I mean, it's very simple. The works are defined in DCUSA, and as Georgina said, the audit arrangements will be for any work completed, and that will cover the SIP work as well as the MEM work. A SIP need DSRs. I'm not sure what I mean. The trouble is with acronyms, they can mean different things to different people. So I'm not really sure what DSR means in this context.
If someone wants to elaborate on the question, feel free to. Otherwise, we'll you can let us know afterwards or by service desk ticket, and we'll attempt to respond as well. But we'll park that one for now, I think. To clarify, there are not new versions on the D139 and D2 being created, just new scenario variants in place, so a SIP can issue to a non-appointed supplier.
New scenario variants are correct. They are for a number of flows, and not just the 139 and the D2. All of them, except the new market message that are involved in the solution, are entirely new scenario variants between the SIPs and the suppliers, or the SIP and the DNOs. And so a SIP can issue to a non-appointed supplier. I don't get that.
Again,
only
if there's anyone
send the flow to a registered supplier for that meter point.
Alex has his hand raised. Is it your question,
That's
Alex?
all.
Yeah, that's probably just the way I've worded that. So for example, as a supplier, if the SIP is on site is a MEM that's not our registered mark, for example.
That's correct. So if your SIP on site and you need to send a supplier a flow, and you're not that supplier's MEM, that's the purpose of the roll code on these new scenario variants. So it will allow the supplier to receive the flows from you as the non-appointed SIP for that site.
Sure, that's cool. But there's no changes to the actual structure of those flows or anything like that.
Nothing.
It's just
Absolutely
a new
the same.
scenario variant.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks for the clarification, Alex. Next question then. For clarity, will R0101, I think I should say, and R21 have any impact on MEMS not intending to become SIP accredited, i.e. are there any system change or flow changes for non-SIP MEMS?
Do you have to make the changes if you're not going to be a SIP? So probably a more technical question than I can answer, if I'm honest. I mean, clearly the SIPs that want to operate as the members that want to operate as SIPs have obviously got to make the changes to their system. I suppose the point of those flows, that other MEMs aren't going to be receiving those flows or initiating those flows, so they probably don't need to make those changes. But I think we'll have to take that one away, because I'm not sure about the release of scenario variants and whether in the pre-release information that would impact the other MEMs having to make these changes or not. I'm sorry, I don't have the correct answer for that one.
We'll look to include an answer to that one in the FAQs published afterwards. But if it was someone who raised that question and they want to drop us an email afterwards or get in touch with Colette afterwards, then let us know and we can follow up with you specifically on that point.
Yeah.
Okay. The next question. Qualification related question. Again, maybe G can support with this one, but is there a narrow type of MEM qualification to support this, or do I have to achieve full MEM accreditation even if I only intend to do SIP work?
I can indeed help with this. You do have to be a fully accredited MEM in order to become a SIP. There is a separate change going on, which is R0064, which is looking into separating out the meter installer role versus the meter operator role. But that is outside of this. So at the moment, you have to be a fully accredited MEM to become a SIP.
Right.
The reason for that, we decided when we started looking at this right at the offset, was that at the end of the day, you're working on another supplier's asset and another MEM is managing that asset. And therefore, we want to have confidence that the person working on that asset is appropriately qualified and is capable of recognising the issues that that MEM would be concerned about. And therefore, we feel it's appropriate that they are appropriately qualified to be on that asset.
Thank you. The new flow yet to be named will not need to be used until the end of November. Is that correct? And why do we need it at all if the work carried out is completed?
Okay, so the new flow is still to be given a number. It is the work complete flow. And if for those SIPs that are going to start operating, it will be implemented as soon as they are able to implement it and start working. And those parties, supply parties that are also capable of being ready for the 30th of June and to receive flows will also be used from that point forward. Why do we need it? It was a supplier request to have this information as a sort of, I suppose, a level of reassurance that because this information isn't held in anybody's system anywhere, because if a supplier sends their MEM out, then there's an appointment flow followed by a request for action by the supplier to the MEM, and there's a lot of audit trails around the different interactions between the parties in the industry. And because this is not under a contractual relationship between the supplier and the consumer, but separately between the landlord and effectively an unrelated party, the suppliers felt that there needed to be some evidence that the SIP had been on site for any concerns that they might find after the work was completed. So if, heaven forbid, the SIP goes crazy and leaves the situation in the site in a dangerous situation, that the supplier has got some record of who did the work and can then instigate whatever formal action needs to take place. So it was really more of an audit requirement, as well as the information about checking out on the third party or medical dependency on electricity. So there was a reason for it, but it is really it's for information only, and doesn't require acting on unless you choose to.
Thanks, Colette. Are there SLAs for incident investigation?
So the DNOs have their category A, B and C reporting and the SLAs that go with that. And any other faults, we've asked that the suppliers, in the same spirit of the category A danger reports that are sent to the supplier when it's a dangerous situation related to the meter, are treated the same way with that sort of 3-hour turnaround. and for fault reporting.
No, can I just clarify what I mean by that? Sorry, interrupting you there.
Okay.
We've had a recent example where somebody illegally has been in and they've left a reverse polarity, and it was an EV charging point that was getting installed. So it was really just, will we have is there a service level agreement within their contract that if we instigate an investigation because they were the last authorised person on site to have touched that installation, obviously it's still our customer, do they have a service level agreement in there that they'll get an incident investigation to us as the supplier by a period of time?
Between the SIP and the person who contracted them?
The SIP, because they'll be the one responsible for it, won't they?
Okay, so, but which contract are we talking about? The contract between the SIP and the premise owner?
I'm just meaning as part of their obligation as a SIP, do they have a service level agreement that they'll do an incident investigation? But, you know, if we raise an issue with them that their operative has left a reverse polarity on site?
Well, we won't have sight of what's in their contracts. We can provide some contractual guidance, but we don't have sight of what's in the contract between the SIP and the premise owner with regard to the work that they carry out for them. I don't know if there's anything in DACUSA between the SIP who accedes to DACUSA and the work, the scope of the work that they undertake, or whether there's anything in there. I don't think this was brought up as a concern during the development of this solution, and I don't think in any of the consultation so far that we've come across this point. I think to introduce something would need a change to put in, and it probably would need to go into the DACUSA because that's where the liability framework sits in terms of the incident investigation, because the liabilities sit there. I'm afraid I think I'm going to have to defer that one to DACUSA. We can send an email over to DACUSA code manager and ask if they've got any information that they could share on this, but I don't recall it even coming up as a concern in any of the development work groups regarding this.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I haven't got a better answer.
Thanks, Anne, for your question. The next question then, how can suppliers be obliged to provide telephone contacts for metering emergencies to SIPs who could work at any point 24/7 without R53?
Afraid I'm going to have to look up what R53 is.
Yep, me too.
Bear with me a minute, I can't remember them all.
Emergency contact telephone numbers for DNOs and suppliers and MEMS.
I think that one's finished yet, is it? Has that change been completed?
No, it's not been completed yet. There's a working group later this week on it.
Okay, so in question related to what's in our scope of R53, I can't speak to that. How can suppliers be able to provide a telephone contact for metering emergencies to SIPs who could work at any point? I'm not sure that that change requires you to provide an emergency contact number for a SIP.
I mean, I'll come in here for me.
Hi, Lee.
So, hiya. I think my thinking here is this work could be done at any point overnight, for example. We would want to go out and work on certain SLAs, but to my knowledge, we don't have any SLAs at the moment. It's a genuine issue for DNOs at the moment in terms of going to site, finding a meter's at fault as opposed to a supply, and then getting a supplier to go out and actually rectify the metering. And that scenario effectively falls to the same, it feels the same for a SIP turning up to site, being unable to get the meter to work again, and therefore having to refer to the supplier. And I think for me, I was thinking R53 is probably the one which fixes that, but it's not live yet.
Didn't. So it probably is, but I mean, the thing with this is, I mean, it's unlikely that the SIP will be working overnight where there are consumers in the premises.
In industrial and commercial, I'd suggest
That's what I'm
overnight's probably
saying.
the way to go.
Yeah, I think in terms of domestics, they aren't likely to be in this space. I think in terms of non-domestics, not entirely certain what to suggest. I think the remedy is in R53, and have a look at it there. I don't think it's in either of these two changes. Because the first point of contact for this, the meter is owned by the supplier, not by the SIP, and therefore the SIP might identify a problem, or you can make safe, but it would still want the supplier to. And if it's a non-domestic premise, then I dare say the issue would be that the SIP will report it to the supplier, and the supplier will deal with it as per their own sort of contractual arrangements.
Kind of goes back to the earlier point though. Without SLAs, that could be anything. You know, if this happens on a bank holiday,
yeah,
that's not
absolutely.
good.
But as I say, I think.
ENA, do you have a point to elaborate on this one?
Yeah, R53 is moving along to try and address this issue. It's an issue that the DNOs have been living with for quite a while, and that is that supplier parties aren't available out of hours during weekends and long weekends and for emergency metering cover, and so the DNOs tend to get all those calls one way or another. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them. But so yeah, the SIP will just make that problem bigger if they start calling the DNO for this issue, which is not a DNO asset issue. But yeah, we do need the industry to get together and try and find a way around this somehow, and R53 provides that opportunity. That was all.
Very much. Yeah, I believe R53 is currently in the solution development stage, and I believe last week there was a closure of a request for information on R53. So I think someone mentioned a workshop coming up. So we're in the midst of a big level of activity on R53. So hopefully we should see momentum on that change imminently.
For me, I'm looking at that and thinking that'll probably land in November, when actually we'll probably not need the phone numbers so much anyway, because we'll have data flows and so on. So it might just be an interim issue, but it does feel like it adds between June and November potential additional burdens, either in DNOs and ultimately the customer's direction. Hopefully in small quantities, though, as we say.
Thanks for
I think
raising that.
these are going to be rare scenarios on rare scenarios, especially if it's done outside of working hours, in traditional working hours, because I mean it's.
Yeah, I accept that probably is rare, Colette, but
yeah,
you don't. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of a customer who's been off for 3 days because of this situation, I think is the point. But yeah, I do agree it probably will be rare.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, isn't it? That the SIP who does this work at a domestic level is going to make contact with the supplier in whatever way they can. And we've asked for people to confirm how they want this. They won't de-energise unless they think they can re-energise within the same day. And it's only when something untoward happens, like something goes faulty or damaged. But again, these days suppliers, while they're not 24/7 businesses, I don't think are always uncontactable. But then I don't work for a supplier anymore, so I can't really speak for them. But again, I think that's the thing that's being resolved through R53, isn't it?
Yeah,
thanks for raising the points.
They are uncontactable, and that's why they in desperation they ring the DNO usually.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, as I say, let R53 note it as an interim
Note
issue.
it, but I don't think we can fix it. Sorry.
Fantastic, thank you. The next question, or the next point to raise, I think it's related to a point that was raised previously, that meter reading can be essential for suppliers where the site's not easily accessible, and these can be impactful for settlement. Have we already discussed this point here, Colette?
Yeah, we did. And I think we're saying, it's, ideally the SIP should be able to reinitiate the comms when they re-energise, because, the comms shouldn't be something that fails just because then the supply's gone off and it comes back on again. I thought that these were a bit like sort of like most electrical equipment these days, where you know, once you reboot it, it kicks back in again. But we do appreciate there'll be some instances where that doesn't happen, and therefore we're asking you in the consultation, do you want that by phone or do you want that by flow?
Next point, I think it's on the DCUSA change legal text, which only obliges the SIP to pre-notify DNOs if a new flow or APP was made available. If neither are available, the obligation falls away.
So yeah, that's true. When the working group was the original thinking of the DCUSA working group was there was going to be some sort of spreadsheet sent through a portal via DCUSA. I think this got changed quite late on. So when we were drafting this, I think we were working on the same assumption that spreadsheet approach was still the default solution until another solution was going to be made available. But then the addition of the don't send anything if the app or a flow is not available seems to have been a later solution. So the DNOs are happy not to receive pre-notes until either an app or a new market message is made available. So that's a statement of fact.
Paul?
Oh yes, Colette, just to clarify, the DNOs have decided to go with an industry flow, and
DCP
that's
419.
Yeah, DCP 419, that's the option. We did talk about having an app, but it didn't end up as being favoured by the DNO, so we're just going to pursue a flow on this one.
And that I was at the first work group for that last week, so that's just starting off its journey.
Yeah.
Great, thanks for the clarification. The next point, the DCUSA accession explicitly states the SIP must be able to communicate fault categories. So why not via the 126 for B and C faults?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The D126 is part of the solution for B and C category faults.
Is there anyone who'd like to clarify the question so we can answer it more clearly?
You've already clarified that actually now, but it's just earlier on there was talk of manual phone calls going into DNOs, which is fine for
That
A's.
was but that's what you normally do for category A, yes. But for B and C's,
I was struggling with for those two, because I think the SIP should be able to raise 135s and 126s to get output off the back of them for go live.
For the period of time between, if the DNO is not ready to accept the new variants at the end of June for these flows from the SIP, then they'll need to provide a telephone number to take those calls in.
Right, okay. So it's the DNO dependency, it's not unilateral. Okay.
Well, for those ones, because they only go to the DNO, don't they?
They do. It's the 126s which get output to suppliers. I guess where we'd find out the resolution of the 126, kind of while it's in that flow. But yeah, I mean, if it's DNO dependent, I think I'm fine with that.
If the DNO can implement them all, then it shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah.
Great, thank you, Lee. Moving on to the next question then. Are there, I think this is addressed by the fact that SIPs have to be fully accredited MEMS, but are there rep parties who have applied to be a SIP that don't currently use sealing pliers, and what's in place to ensure industry compliance for last at site?
So you're right, Paul, it is a requirement that the SIP is accredited MEM and should have its own sealing pliers. Therefore, that shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a point here on struggling to follow some points being made off the back of questions being asked, what clear on what's being required of suppliers and SIPs. Obviously we can't go through the full solution again, but what I really encourage you to do, if you've still question onto this, and the information from Colette or Colette's contact information as the lead change analyst is shared within the change proposal, we fully encourage you to get in touch with us if you need any further clarification on solution. Or through your operational account managers, of course, who can support you and point you in the right direction. Amy, you've got your hand raised there.
Yeah, no, that one was just a question from me, because I think a lot of this, some of the information, if I'm completely honest, coming in from somebody that's not 100% on flows or, you know, what we do as accredited MEMS and more from a high level point of view, it's been quite difficult to follow all of the answers and questions that have been coming in. I don't know, I think you might have mentioned it at the beginning, but is there any opportunity for the questions that have been asked and the answers that have been given off the back of it to be provided to us in some sort of writing format or a slide pack or something, just so that then we can share it with the wider group of our, well, if we're a supplier like myself, like we can share it with the wider group of stakeholders that are involved.
Yep, we're absolutely intending to do that. Claire, is there timescales on when you be able to share that? Within the next week, I would imagine.
No, just give me 5 minutes, please.
No, I need it now, please.
Yeah, just tough. So first thing I'd point you at is the solution document is quite comprehensive. We have approached it from the start of the journey of becoming a SIP right the way through to all the activities that you do on site. The market messages, the screenshots of all the market messages are in there as well, and the clarifications on the business process diagrams are in there as well, so to quite a lower level of detail. So that solution document, the solution overview document, should give you everything you need to know. And then there have been 2 webinars previous to this one where we provided FAQ documents. Now, over the last week or 2, I've been working through those, updating them and consolidating them into a more structured overall FAQ. And what I plan to do is to take the questions from today, I'm not sure how many there are, Paul, in total, but to take those questions from today and insert those into the FAQ document that already exists, and we will publish an updated FAQ document. And I think, Paul, to be fair, is this recording and made available on an enduring basis, or is it short term?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it will be available forever, as long as our YouTube channel stands up.
I think as well, just on that solution document, I think it links to one of the questions that has been raised, but I appreciate that there's probably been other forums and different kind of consultations around this. Unfortunately, I've not been involved prior to now. So for me, it's just, I'm kind of almost trying to catch up a little bit as well. So some of these questions might be a little bit, well, you might have already previously gone over them, but where is that solution document? Is it in the R0101? Because I'm currently looking at the company documents within there, and it doesn't have a clear stated solution document.
Called Solution Overview Document 4.0. It's in the change portal, change page for R101.
That link I put into the chat at 14:58. If you go to that page, and there's there's then a list of associated documents that are down at the bottom, accompanying documents in the bottom left of that page.
Yeah, so that's what I'm looking at the moment. So I just want to.
It's the download R101 Safe Isolation Provider Solution Overview version 4.0.
Solution overview. Right. Okay. So that's all of that information with regards to any type of flows, all of that kind of stuff, and what we need to be able to access and do as a SIP, but also as a supplier that's just receiving those flows. Is that right? Cool. Perfect. Thank you very much.
And thanks, Ryan, who's put the link to the actual document itself in there as well for those who just want the download link. Brilliant. Thank you very much. We're down to the last couple of questions now. We've got a little bit of time left, so we're on track at the moment. I think this one's been answered as well, Colette, but is there a partial implementation approach between June and November?
The workaround that we've proposed, and that's the one where we're saying if you can implement it 30th of June, excellent. If you can't, you can have between the end of June and the 3rd of November to implement it, and you don't have to wait till the 3rd of November. If you're ready to go earlier, you can. The OAMs will maintain a list of everybody's readiness state, so the OAMs will keep in touch with suppliers to check where they are in relation to receiving the flows, or whether they're still on workarounds, and they'll publish a list to the SIPs so that they can switch from workarounds to flows as they need to, as people implement.
Thank you, Colette. What if the SIP connects the wrong tails to the meters in a crowded meter room that causes cross meters, impacting customer bill and increased work for suppliers? You spoke around the regime for liabilities and DCUs, right? Is this part of that consideration again?
Before they want shooting, and then I mean, why would a MEM do this? I mean, this is a qualified accredited MEM, so we start from the premise that they know what they're doing, and you know, this is not something anybody sets out to do, but occasionally some things go wrong, and that's why we have a liabilities framework, and that's why the SIPs are being required to accede to DCUSA to make sure that suppliers and the DNOs have a regime where liabilities can be addressed.
Thank you. And just last two now. Things like ceiling, again, this is more a point to consider, that things like ceiling fall under the BSC code of practice and its TAA regime. So the supplier would own the liability in that case as a consideration.
Don't know why the supplier would own the liability there in this scenario, because it's not the supplier or the supplier's agent that's done that. That's why the liability regime has been put into DCUSA to cover this.
I think that's more around technical assurance audit findings, Colette.
Yeah.
So the work's done, someone goes away, TAA happens 6 months later, site's not sealed. That would be a supplier non-compliance, I think, is what that's trying to get at.
Yeah.
But it's a statement, isn't it? So
yeah, I'm not quite sure how that relates to this change, though.
No, nor me.
Probably relating to a point that was being discussed at the time they raised the question. But
yeah,
if there's further clarification, please feel free to raise it. When comms are lost on gas-only smart installations, the SIP also should notify the gas supplier.
It's a good shout. No one's picked that one up as a point before, so we'll update the documents to include that.
Thank you, Colette. And finally, at the moment, assuming the phasing in of supplier readiness will be managed on a weekly basis rather than daily, as it will be difficult to manage for SIPs.
I doubt if it would be done on a daily basis. I'm not even sure it'd be done on a weekly basis, because of course people will need to be planning ahead to be ready. So I think that they'll give notice as to when they're going to be ready. I don't know how quickly that update will take place, but I will talk as part of the FAQs. We'll address this in terms of the frequency of updates of readiness. So that will be in the FAQs document.
Thank you, Colette. We have managed to get through all of the questions that have been raised. We have a little bit of time left, but I don't want to hang on unless there's any further questions that need to be raised. There's been a lot of questions raised today, and as we mentioned, we're going to aggregate them all into a frequently asked questions document that we'll share with the recording and the slides as well that we've been using as sort of background material today, so that you've got additional reference material. But as I mentioned before as well, Colette's contact details are within the change documents. As the lead change analyst, you'll be more than happy to help with your as you prepare your consultation responses. Remind me when the closing date for consultation is on this one, Colette?
The 16th.
Fantastic. So still got a week to respond to that consultation. So we'd be more than happy to help. And as I mentioned as well, if you're a rec party, you'll have your appointed operational account manager. We'll be more than happy to point you in the right direction for further information with respect to this change as well. There are no further questions. I'm going to just flick over very quickly to a final slide. If you're on Slido now, you will see just a feedback form appear to allow you just to let us know whether you found today's session useful. Generally, I hope that you have. It's been a really positive session in terms of engagement. Probably the most questions I've ever been party to as facilitating one of these sessions, and apologies for the very slight hiccup we had technically earlier today, but hopefully we got through it without too much delay. Colette, did you have any final wrap-up points that you wanted to raise before we close off today?
I just wanted to thank everybody for being actively participating in this. It's encouraging as the code manager to have such interested participation in changes, and to have this level of engagement is really exciting. So while it might feel a little bit painful sometimes, this is really very much welcomed by the code manager, and we're happy to facilitate it. So thank you very much for all your challenging questions, and we'll learn as we go with this sort of thing, that the detail with which you go into things, I think you'll see improves over time. With some of these changes that you think on the face of it look fairly simple, they're never as straightforward as you think. So again, thank you very much, everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you. We'll close the session here. We'll make sure the recording is posted with all the post-event materials over the course of the next couple of days, and the FAQs to follow once we've been able to make sure we've got the comprehensive answers provided to all of them. But again, thank you very much for your engagement today, and we hope you got all your questions answered, and we look forward to seeing your consultation responses and seeing you at Code Manager events coming soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers all.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.